Welcome to Christ Alone Ministries online church. Jesus wanted to deal with the needs of people. He wanted to bring light and clarity. Jesus came into a world where people walked in darkness. People did not know exactly what they needed for life and for godliness. And those who thought that they knew, their pursuit were really nothing. So the concept of seeking blessedness and happiness was already in effect. And it is possible that most of the people who were looking for happiness were looking for it where it cannot be found. Possibly because the definition that people had concerning happiness and blessedness wasn't sound. Today we are only going to look at the first beatitude. That was just a short background on what was happening then. And in verse 3, we read, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The statement sounds like it's paradoxical in some sense. Jesus opens his mouth beginning to teach and says that blessed. I think everybody was curious to hear what the next statement would be as he seeks to define blessedness. And he says, "Blessed are the poor." Really, in the natural world, the poor are not really counted among the blessed. The definition that goes out there in the world, and I do believe that the notion was also common among the people that lived when Jesus lived here on earth physically. The last thing you want to think of when you're contemplating blessedness is poverty. But here Jesus says, "Blessed, happy are the poor." It's very important for us to get to understand what this poverty means. The Bible is clear. It's not just the poor. If we say the blessed are the poor, we could talk about those who are deprived of resources. And what we want to seek to understand today is what spiritual poverty really means. The subject is so important because possessing the kingdom of heaven is in greater sense determined on whether you are really spiritually poor or not. So what is spiritual poverty? I do suppose that when Jesus was talking about spiritual poverty, he was not talking about being deprived of material possessions, wealth, health, and those material things. They are good, because I don't believe that the kingdom of heaven or becoming a member of it is to be hinged on whether you are rich or poor materially. Let me not jump the gun. Let's go straight to some definitions that I've been able to put together. Spiritual poverty is a gracious disposition of soul by which we are emptied of self in order that our being, our souls are filled with Christ. It is a deliberate undertaking. There is self-emptying, self-deprivation. Most of the people who are poor materially, they are not deprived of these means willingly, intentionally. You ask them, they tell you that they are poor materially because of bad fate. But you see, spiritual poverty is deliberate. It is a gracious disposition of soul by which we are emptied of self in order to our being filled with Jesus Christ. The reasons why I'm saying it's deliberate: number one, it entails being or willing to be empty of worldly wealth, if God orders that to be our lot, we know that God is a God of providence. Every good gift comes from Him. God, the Father of lights, according to James. Everything that is God's, whether a man be in possession of much or less, it is from God. To be poor in spirit, it is the willingness to be empty, to lay down. The willingness to empty worldly possessions if God orders that to be our lot. And I use the word providence. God works through providence to have us either gain or lose. There are things a man may be in possession of today, he cannot claim the possession of them tomorrow. There are things that a man is deprived of today, and he may lay hold of them tomorrow. And all depends on the providence of God. To be spiritually poor is to come to a place whereby you are willing that if the Lord wills that I be emptied of all that I think that I have, I am willing to cooperate with God and let it go. Again, I said there's a difference between being poor spiritually and being poor or being deprived of material possessions. There are many poor in the world, as in they don't have much of worldly possessions that could cause people to call them rich. So in the worldly terms, they are poor. But they are not poor in spirit. You can be poor in the worldly view, but spiritually you aren't. You can be poor and high in spirit. You can be poor and greedy. You can be poor and be proud. You can be poor and murmur. You can be poor and be full of covetousness, complaining, and discontent. So for you, we would rightfully say that you are poor of means, but not poor in spirit. That's very important to clarify. Most of us, when we learned these Beatitudes, we grew thinking that all poor people belong to God, all rich people do not belong to God. That God is closer to the poor than He's closer to the rich. That poor people are closer to the heart of God than the rich people. It's not always the case. You can be poor and have no fellowship with God. And you can be rich in terms of worldly possessions and gain, and be poor in spirit, be in fellowship with God, and at the end, gain the kingdom of heaven. That's something that we need to know, that to be poor in spirit, really, it's that deliberate, self-intended emptying of self. Be willing to lay things down and being stripped of the things that you think you enjoy possession of, if the Lord orders it through His providences. And sometimes, by the way, God will not only work through providences to call you to lay loose some of those things through His word. He'll give you finances and give you the guidelines on how that wealth is to be used. He will entrust things in your hands and still command you on how they are to be used. And rightfully so, because He's the one who gives. So that you will not find yourself at loggerheads with God. You will not find yourself debating with God. You will not find yourself arguing with God. It will require you to have what we call spiritual poverty. It will be a question that will determine whether you are spiritually poor or not. We must accommodate ourselves to our poverty if the Lord so deems it fit. To be spiritually poor means that we know and we are willing to accommodate poverty and lack. We are willing to be abased if the end result is that God is honored and glorified through that. If you read the book of Philippians chapter 4 verse 12 and verse 13, the Apostle Paul gives his personal testimony. The believers in the church he was addressing in Philippi, and there are words there that he writes in verse 12 and verse 13. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. Then he says in verse 13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So if you look at verse 12 very thoughtfully, you'll see a man who was endowed with this capacity, this gracious disposition of the soul to be ready at God's call, lay aside worldly possessions for Christ's sake. Poor in spirit is to set loose to all worldly wealth and not set our hearts upon it. It's not in a proud manner or pretense to make ourselves poor by throwing away what God has given. No. It's being ready and willing to accept poverty, especially when it comes upon us for obeying God's will. There are things that we have in life, and sometimes doing what God requires us to do at that particular moment in our lives, it would mean that we lose them. It would mean that we let them go. A soul that is that holds the things and the possessions of this world loosely, it is a soul that bears the characteristic of one that is poor in spirit. Another good example in the Bible of a man who lived and walked with such kind of a disposition of heart and mind was Job. We know very well that Job was a rich man, and if you want to know how rich Job was, just read his book. Read the first chapter actually.